and welcome to the Park Life Podcast. My name is Mike. I'm a travel agent that specializes in all things Disney. This is episode 56 of the Park Life Podcast, and it's chapter 3 of a series about Walt Disney World and the history of Walt Disney World. Chapter 1 was Why Florida. Chapter 2 was about opening day attractions. And today, chapter 3, I'm calling The Ticket. We're going to talk about ticket prices, the evolution of the ticket, fast pass systems through to what today's existing systems are all about, park hopping, you name it, we'll cover it in today's chapter 3, The Ticket of the history of Walt Disney World. So let's start. 1971 is when the Magic Kingdom opened. And again, at that point in time, it was the only park that Disney had offered. Epcot came along about 10 years later. So in 1971, admission to get into Walt Disney World, into the Magic Kingdom, was $3.50 for an adult, and the price lowered for teens and children. Now, I have to caution, and we'll get into this here in a minute, that just got you into the park. You had to then buy ride tickets to ride some of the rides, and we'll cover that here in a little bit. But I'm going to go through some price increases over the years for the Magic Kingdom specifically. So 1971, $3.50 for an adult. 1973, it went up a dollar to $4.50 an adult. 1975, it jumped all the way to $6 for an adult. We're going to kind of move along here now. 1980, it was $8 for an adult. 1985 was a big jump, $21.50. But I'll explain why that big jump happened here in a little bit. Moving along, 1990, $31 to get into the Magic Kingdom. In 1995, it came up to $37 for an adult pass. In the year 2000, $46. I'm going to jump quicker here. In 2010, it was $82 for the cost of an adult admission into the Magic Kingdom. In 2015, we went to $105. We crossed the 3-digit threshold then. In 2020 was $125 for an adult admission ticket into the Magic Kingdom. And today in 2025, the ticket price for an adult will range anywhere from $140 to $190. And that is where Disney kind of got into in the last handful of years dynamic pricing based on their historical information of when the parks would be more crowded and less crowded. The less crowded days, you got a better price because they were encouraging people to come to the parks. The more crowded, anticipated days where people were going to be there anyway, the price was higher. So let's go backwards. 1971, the park opened, $3.50 for an adult. That got you into the park. You then had to buy a ticket package. In the 1970s, starting in 1971, that ticket package cost $5.75. And then through the 1970s, it went up from there, $5.75 plus, so about $6.50. That gave you 11 ride tickets. And they classified the rides A, B, C, D, and E, where E was the most coveted rides. And you might get two A ride tickets, two B ride tickets, one C ride ticket, and so forth, totaling a total of 11 rides. So as an adult in the 1970s, you're paying $3.50 in 1971 to get in, plus an additional $5.75 to ride 11 different rides in the Magic Kingdom. So for an adult, you were paying close to $10. Now, in 2025, we would all happily pay $10 to ride all of the rides or even some of the rides in the Magic Kingdom. Far different cry 50 some years later as to pricing. In 1980 and 1981, so in 1980, the admission to get into the park was $8, so it almost tripled, clearly more than doubled from 1971. The ticket packages still existed in 1980 and 1981. It was about $10.50 on up for the ride ticket package, and that got you 12 rides. Again, classifications A through E, with E being the most coveted rides. So I told you that the price in 1980 was $8 to get in. 1985, it jumped to $21.50, almost tripling. In June of 1982, Disney World did away with the e-tickets and went to the all-inclusive park admission ticket. In 1982, that price was $15 for an adult to get into the park and ride all of the rides. Interestingly enough, 1982 was also the first year that Walt Disney World introduced the concept of an annual pass. Now, if you're an annual pass holder today, you're going to be jealous. But in 1982, the annual pass cost $100 for an adult. I mentioned e-tickets, and that was the ticket packages that you had to purchase in the 1970s through 1981 into early 1982. You would buy those ticket booklets, and again, they were alphabetized tickets, A through E, with the E being the most popular. Depending upon how old you are, you may or may not remember those days. You may not have been around for those days. I was there in 1976 for the first time as a 6 year old. I vaguely remember that, but again, it carried all the way into almost about the time Epcot opened is when they kind of did away with the ticket package booklets and went to an all-inclusive ticket purchase. So prices started at $350 in 1971. You fast forward 54 years later, and here we are $140 to $190 to get into the Magic Kingdom for a single day admission for an adult. Um, I didn't write all of this down, but I can tell you when I did my research, while you can always assume that price increases were partly because of inflation and the cost of living changes from 1971 to 2025, I'd like to tell you that's exactly to the penny why the prices went from $3.50 to 140 up to 190. The reality is that with inflation and cost of living, the 1971 ticket price of $3.50 is a far cry from what it would be with just inflation and cost of living adjustments. I think it's closer to $80 or $90. So there's a lot more built into the cost of a ticket today. So there's your ticket history. Now let's talk about the concept of the Fast Pass, Genie Plus, Lightning Lane Multi Pass, essentially Disney's system of allowing you to kind of skip the lines, skip the standby lines. The first system that Disney introduced was the Fast Pass system. It did not come into existence until 1999. So when you think about it, for what is that, 48 years from, or sorry, 28 years from 1971 to 1999, 28 years, all we had was standby lines. And that was Disney's biggest complaint from its customers was waiting in the long lines for rides. In 1999, one of the Disney Imagineers had all of the statistics, all the numbers, knew exactly how long it took to wait in the lines for the rides, and knew how many people they could get on a ride in 1 hour. And so they put their pen to paper and devised the Fast Pass system to allow a certain number of guests per hour to get a Fast Pass ticket that allowed them to skip the standby line getting on the ride. When you think about it, let's assume that it's a small world, and I'm just grabbing that out of the air. If they knew they could get 500 guests on that ride in an hour, and I know it's far more than that, I'm just trying to do simple math here. They knew they could get 500 in an hour. If they gave 200 fast passes back in 1999 to allow 200 people to essentially bypass the standby line in that hour, they would essentially still have 300 people that could ride the ride, but they would be standing in line for the longest amount of time. At the end of that hour, Disney was still servicing 500 guests on It's a Small World, just dynamically changing the mechanism so that some people got to wait shorter while others had to wait a little bit longer. So in 1999, FastPass was introduced. It was a new timed ticket system. There were kiosks placed at the rides themselves. Now, in 1999, when this first started, they did not have kiosks at every single ride. They started out with the most popular rides, and eventually kiosks opened up at all of the rides. You would go up to the kiosk, insert your park ticket, and get a paper fast pass for a timed return to that attraction. Now, when it first opened in 1999, you had to go into the park, insert your ticket to get that paper pass. And again, there were only so many they would give out per hour. And once that hour was up, they'd move to the next hour and so on. And so people had to really almost race to the ride that they wanted the fast pass for as soon as they got to the park to get a fast pass because eventually they would be out. But that's what you would do. Now, eventually, they did add kiosks to all of the park ticket rides, and you would just enter your park ticket to get that fast pass paper ticket that gave you a return time. So that was 1999. In 2013, a full 14 years later, Disney then introduced Fast Pass Plus, got rid of the paper ticket system, and introduced the digital usage of the My Disney Experience app to get your Fast Pass tickets for return times. At that time in 2013, when they advanced to Fast Pass Plus, you were able to make three picks and then use the, once you scanned in, you could then get an additional ride and get as many as you could throughout the day until the passes were gone. But it was all digital, which allowed more efficiency for the guests because you weren't having to run from ride to a kiosk just to get a paper ticket to then have to go back to that ride at a later time. If you think about it, when the Fast Pass system first came out with the paper tickets in the kiosk, you essentially had to visit the ride twice just to ride it once. First time to go get your pass, second time to use the pass. So with the advent of FastPass Plus, it made the guest experience better. It saved you time instead of running to a kiosk to get a ticket to come back later on to that same ride to ride it. You do it electronically and you'd be in line for a different ride and riding that other ride. So you got more out of the park with the digital use through My Disney Experience. It also allowed you to modify. So in the paper ticket fast pass system, and look, I bet if we all raised our hands, most of us would say we'd love to go back to that system. I think it's partly because it was free, and partly because you didn't have to rely on your phone. But I think if we really did the analysis, we'd realize that the initial fast pass system probably wasn't the best use of our time. Like I said, you had to visit the ride twice, and there was no flexibility. Whatever the return time was on the ticket, that's what you had to live with. Moved to FastPass Plus in 2013, and you got that return time. If you didn't like it, you could try to modify for a different time. So it gave you more flexibility. And again, you're still making the most of your time because you could be doing that while you're in line and standby line for a ride that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get in line for because you'd have to be racing over to a kiosk. It also allowed Disney to say, hey, we want to reward our resort guests for being a resort guest staying on property. It's all about money, right? And so staying on property meant money in Disney's pocket versus staying off property, money in someone else's pocket. So Disney resort guests were allowed to pre-select their three rides on the FastPass Plus system through the My Disney Experience app 60 days in advance, while the off-property guests did not get that same advantage. This also allowed Disney to introduce the concept of tiered rides. So the most popular rides were tier one, and all of the other rides were tier two. And Disney could say, hey, when you make your three pre selects, you can pick one tier one ride and two tier two rides. And then as you rode, you could make new selections. But it helped Disney control um, everybody flocking to the most popular rides and those rides essentially being consumed by nothing but FastPass Plus guests. If you think about it, if we could have all selected tier one rides and we did that, the fast pass line would have looked like the standby line because we'd had far more people in it. So Disney needed to control numbers, needed the ability to keep the fast pass lines fast so that you felt like it was worth getting those reservations and utilizing them. So now we're going to jump to 2020. And whether you're 15 years old or 50 years old or 75 years old, 2020 has become the new historical marker for us. March of 2020, COVID was rampant around the country, around the world. Everything that we were doing day in and day out was changing drastically. Kids were remote learning. Many people were not being able to go into work. They were having to work remotely. Those that had to be on premise were wearing masks. Places like Disney closed down. And so the world changed drastically. And I know for me, even today, when I talk about things in the past, it's was it before COVID or was it after COVID? And the dynamic changes drastically. So March of 2020, COVID closed down the Disney parks. When they reopened in July, Disney suspended the Fast Pass Plus system. Now, you could probably think that maybe it was because they were already thinking about advancing to the next system that I'll get to here in a little bit. But I think the reality was, and if you were there, we went in October of 2020. The parks were operating at about 20 to 25% capacity. They limited the number of people drastically into the parks. And therefore, the waits and lines weren't nearly as long because there were fewer people to be in a standby line. The lines seemed incredibly long, and I'll never forget this because they had stickers in the standby queue lines every 6 feet for social distancing, something that we all got very familiar with in 2020. So the wait may not have been very long, but the length of the line seemed long because there were 6 foot gaps between parties. But again, because of the park capacity limitations, there was really no need to have the Fast Pass Plus system operating at that point in time. So I think that truly is why Disney initially suspended it. But that was in 2020. It wasn't until August of 2021 that Disney said, hey, we are indefinitely suspending, doing away with, canceling, discontinuing, whatever word you want to use, the Fast Pass Plus system, and introduced a new paid system that was called Genie Plus. So that came out in late 2021. October 2021 specifically is when Genie Plus was launched. And at that point, it was a paid system. The initial cost when it rolled out was $15 per person per park or per day. And you could make one selection at a time. So it was similar to the original Fast Pass, but you didn't have to go to a kiosk. It was all electronic and you had to pay for the service. After you rode your first ride, you could pick your next ride on the My Disney Experience app through the Genie Plus system. You could pre-purchase Genie Plus for the duration of your stay ahead of time. So at least you had it purchased and then you made your selections. So that was in October of 2021. Now we jump forward when you think about it. So Fast Pass was around in 1990. Fast Pass, I'm sorry, 1999. Gotta go back in my notes. 99 was Fast Pass. For 14 years that existed. Then in 2013, we went to Fast Pass Plus. That stayed around for 7 years until COVID happened. And then in October 2021, Genie Plus launched. In really a short amount of time, Genie Plus was then replaced with the Lightning Lane Multipass. That came out in July of 2024. So Genie Plus stuck around for less than 3 years, which is really a short amount of time when you think about the grand scheme of things. So the Lightning Lane Multipass was a paid skip the line service, again, started in July of 2024. You were allowed to pre-select days in advance. Resort guests could make their pre-select 7 days in advance, while non-resort guests could make their pre-selects 3 days in advance. An advantage for everybody, but certainly, again, Disney wanted to provide the greatest advantage to the resort guest. The cost ranged by day and by park, which also made it very dynamic. I talked about the dynamic pricing for Magic Kingdom entry today versus the 1970s. The same thing came about with Lightning Lane Multipass. Disney knew historically which parks on which days and which days of the week, which days of the month, which months were busier, and the prices would be higher for the Lightning Lane Multipass. Disney continued the idea of ride tiers, with tier one being the most popular and tier two being the less popular rides. And you can make one tier one selection and two tier two selections. The other thing that Disney added, which I think was really kind of under the radar, they didn't really advertise it much, and I think it was a great part of the purchase, was that all ride photos in the instance of like Tower of Terror, the ride videos were all included in the purchase of the Lightning Lane Multipass. So if you were a family who was there to ride the rides, not necessarily do character meet and greets, in the photos that you might be getting from the photo pass system that you purchased, you were getting those included on your rides through Lightning Lane Multipass. Again, I think something that Disney didn't advertise very well, and a lot of people didn't take advantage of or didn't know to take advantage of it. Now with the Lightning Lane Multipass, you can make your selections at 7 a.m. Eastern. Um, you could only ride one ride per day with the system. So, for instance, if I purchased Lightning Lane Multipass and I selected Jungle Cruise and It's a Small World and Dumbo as my pre-selects, I went rode Jungle Cruise. I could not select Jungle Cruise again with the Lightning Lane Multipass system. I could stand in the standby line, but I could not get a second Lightning Lane for Jungle Cruise. And the same applied for all rides. Again, Disney wanted to try to allow as many of the buying multi-pass guests to be able to experience every single ride as much as possible. Now there are only so many Lightning Lane multi-pass slots for Jungle Cruise for the entire day, but by limiting each guest to only doing it once through the Lightning Lane system, it gave more guests the chance to get a Lightning Lane for Jungle Cruise when they purchased the system. So, quick evolution of Fast Pass to Fast Pass Plus to Genie Plus to what we have today, Lightning Lane Multi-Pass. We also have Lightning Lane Single Pass, where the most popular rides you can purchase a skip the line, quote unquote, pass to ride. Prawn, Rise of the Resistance, Flight of Passage. Those high-end popular rides, Guardians of the Galaxy, Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, you could purchase those Lightning Lane single passes. You cannot ride those through the multi-pass system, though. So that was a unique twist on the system, but something that has been effective for Disney with the most popular rides. So there's your ticket prices, and there's the evolution of Fast Pass to today's Lightning Lane multi-pass. Now, there's a couple other quick hitters that I'll touch on, then we'll wrap up for today's chapter 3. First is single rider lines. Again, Disney wanted to find the way to solve the biggest complaint they had in the 70s and 80s, and that was the long wait in lines. They rolled out Fast Pass to help solve that, and then that evolution to continue to solve it and give customers the most flexibility in doing less waiting in line. The other thing that Disney started to roll out in some rides was single rider. So you think about certain rides, and I'll mention the first one off the top of my head that I remember a single rider happening for, and that was the Rock and Roller Coaster at Hollywood Studios. Roller coaster that sits two people in each car. If you were a family of three riding and they didn't have single rider line, there were times where two of you sat in a car and one sat in the car in front or behind, and nobody sat next to your third guest in your party. So Disney realized there was an opportunity to get more people through the line by filling every seat in the Rock and Roller Coaster ride. So the advent of the single rider line came about, where Disney added really a third line for single rider. You had your standby, you had your Fast Pass Plus, Genie Plus, Lightning Lane Multi-Pass line, and then a single rider line, so that that party of three, when they got up and got on the ride, Disney had a line of single rider guests that they could say, "You come on up, you'll join that person in row 4," or whatever the row would be. Help Disney fill all of the seats, making each ride capacity, which meant more people through all of the lines, so more people got to enjoy the rides. Now, interestingly enough, today, single rider does not exist in the Magic Kingdom. It has been reserved for the other three parks. But when you think about Magic Kingdom, a lot of the rides are more geared towards family sizes. Teacups can fit three, sometimes four if you've got small children. Pirates of the Caribbean is a full bench. Jungle Cruise. Think about those rides where it's fewer scenarios where only two riders can fit. And so there has been really no significant need for a single rider. Could that change with like Tron? Certainly it could. Or Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, it certainly could. But today, single rider has been limited to Hollywood Studios, Animal Kingdom, and Epcot. Hollywood Studios, I already mentioned Rock and Roller Coaster. They have Rise of the Resistance single rider line, and they also have Smuggler's Run single rider line. Now, one thing to note, doing single rider in most instances, you skip a lot of the pre-show stuff. So if doing all of the pre-show stuff for Rise of the Resistance, for instance, is important to you, then single rider may not be the best way to go. If you hop over to Animal Kingdom, Everest is the single rider line ride. at that park. Again, roller coaster bench with two people, getting the most capacity in each car or each train of the roller coaster. Single rider helps do that. And then at Epcot, Remy and Test Track have single rider line. Now they have um, experimented with single rider at Soarin' at different times, but to date it is not stuck as a permanent single rider ride. Maybe we'll see that happen again. That's a unique one because it seats about 12 people across the row. Don't quote me on 12, but somewhere in that neighborhood. And so they do their best to try to fit the number in your party to a line that when the next party comes in, if there's room for them, they'll fit, and they try to fill all those seats. But inevitably, you could have 11 of the 12 seats spoken for, and maybe single rider fits that bill. We'll see if that comes about. But again, just another way for Disney to try to help expedite the wait for people in the most popular rides. The last thing I wanted to just quickly mention that goes with tickets, and that is park hopping. Park hopping is, part of the Disney lexicon that we all know, and some of us love, some of us don't love park hopping. It's individual preference. But I thought this was interesting, and maybe you get to a place where you start to think that things that we have today, we've had for, quote unquote, ever. Park hopping did not start at Disney World until 2005. So we've only had park hopping for 20 years of the 54 years of Disney. Haven't even had it for half of Disney World's existence. But park hopping in 2005 introduced, it gave people more flexibility in doing what they wanted to do with the parks. It does add the added transportation from one park to another. And we'll do a transportation chapter down the road here that I'll talk about all of those sorts of things. But it did give you some flexibility. I know for me as a family, if we were doing Animal Kingdom for our park day, and that park closed at 7 or sometimes 6 or sometimes 8, depending on time of year, instead of just going back to our resort, it allowed us to park hop over to one of the other parks and seeing the nighttime show. I'm a huge fireworks guy, so some of our family might have been done for the day and they went back to the resort to get off their feet. Me and usually at least my middle son and sometimes my oldest son, we'd head over to Magic Kingdom or head over to Hollywood Studios or Epcot to see the nighttime show before we then called it a night. So it gave us a little flexibility. There's always those people in today's environment that love to do the 4 park challenge. Can't do that without park hoppers. So being able to say that I did 2 or 3 things in each of the 4 parks all in the same day is a fad in today's park hopper world. But again, prices are far different today than they used to be, but Disney has introduced some flexibility with park hopping, with single rider, the Lightning Lane multi-pass. I know we have to pay for those today versus the free fast pass system, but it's Disney's way to try to creatively find options to make the most out of our experience, even if it costs a little more out of our pocket. We can enjoy a vacation and come home and say that we got to do everything that we wanted to do and then some. So, in chapter 3 of the history of Walt Disney World, that gives you a breakdown of where Disney was with park tickets back in the 70s, with the e-tickets that you had to purchase, the ticket booklets, to the all-inclusive ticket that started in the early 80s, to where we are today with the advent of paid skip the line services, paid park hopping services, and then the advantage of things like single rider. Disney's always looking to advance. That was Walt Disney's charter was, that the park is never finished. It's always evolving. And that goes not only for rides, attractions, shows, but how they manage guests, the crowds, the lines. And so will Lightning Lane Multipass someday be taken over by something else? If I were a betting man, I'd say yes. Will we see more single rider lines in certain attractions over the years? Betting man says yes. Will we see different flexibilities like Park Hopper that came about 20 years ago that we can't even envision today? Betting man would say yes. We'll see. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll be talking about the next new Gee Whiz thing that Disney's come out with, whether it's free or paid, that maximizes our experience in the parks. But until then, we get to enjoy what Disney offers us today. And that is a wrap on chapter 3 of the history of Walt Disney World. Be back again next week with chapter 4. It's a secret what it will be, probably because I haven't decided yet. But again, my name is Mike. I am a travel agent that specializes in all things Disney. You can find me on the Park Life Podcast YouTube channel and on Spotify. These podcasts drop Monday mornings at about 5 a.m. Eastern. We also do a live Park Life podcast on Tuesday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. You can find those on the YouTube channel, Park Life Podcast. I also telecast those on my TikTok channel on Mike_Disney Travel. You can join me on either place. Otherwise, you can find me on TikTok and Instagram at Mike_Disney Travel. I also have a Mike_Disney Travel YouTube page, and you can find me on Facebook at Mike's Magical World Vacations. I would love to have you join us on our live podcast on Tuesday nights. You can always drop me a line on any of my social media links that I just shared with you. Would love to have you comment on this podcast. Is there a future podcast you'd like to hear about? Is there a suggested chapter 4, 5, 6, 7 that you'd like to hear about? Let me know. But otherwise, that's a wrap for today. Hope you have a great day. And when you wake up tomorrow, remember, it's a great day to be alive. We'll see you again next week. Bye, everybody.